Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk for a bit about Appointment with Death, the 19th book in Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot series. Now, once again, I'll talk for a few minutes about the book in a completely spoiler-free manner. Then I'll give a warning before proceeding to a spoiler-filled section, where I'll discuss the evidence and the ending. Also, I should mention that in the book itself, there's one minor spoiler for the earlier Poirot novel, Murder on the Orient Express, although nothing that would totally ruin that case. So, Appointment with Death was first published in 1938, and it's another installment in what I like to think of as Agatha Christie's destination murders in the Middle East. Arguably, Murder on the Orient Express is the first of these, although that one occurs in transit. And then after that, we have Murder in Mesopotamia, Death on the Nile, here Appointment with Death, which could also aptly be titled Murder in Petra. Now, Agatha Christie did a fair amount of traveling in her life, including traveling on the actual Orient Express train, so I assume these are all murder settings that she concocted from her own travels. I generally find these destination mystery settings pretty interesting, providing a refreshing change of scenery from the stereotypical British country house mystery in which many of Christie's works take place, especially some of her earlier ones. For readers, it gives us a chance to go on a mini vacation from the comfort of our homes. Petra is an archaeological and tourist destination, now also a UNESCO World Heritage Site in present-day Jordan, and it's worth checking out some pictures online of the impressive sculptures cut out of stone there by the ancient Nabateans. The behavior of characters in these non-British settings does occasionally fall into early 20th century stereotypes, although to the author's credit, this is usually done in a satirical way. In this story, we encounter an outspokenly anti-Semitic native Arab, although an offhand comment actually suggests that perhaps these views are ones he developed while pursuing a Western education, which he sees as placing him above the Bedouins he employs. Another character, the insufferable Member of Parliament, Lady Westholme, is a wonderful portrayal of a foreign vacationer who comes to experience the country on vacation and proceeds to complain and tell the locals how they're doing everything wrong. And I could tell Christie had so much fun writing Lady Westholme's mannerisms. Now, Christie does more than just change the location. She also introduces some new plot elements that make the foreign setting of the murder a bonus rather than the core feature. For example, this story stood out immediately to me because of the way it opens. In the very first page, Raymond Boynton announces to us, the readers, that he's going to kill his mother in the billiard room with the candlestick. All right, I made up the last part. He doesn't reveal his plan yet, but we do know that there is one. Of course, this being a murder mystery, our immediate reaction is, well, that means he can't be the killer, right? And later in the novel, in a genius moment of sort of meta-awareness, one of the policemen voices our exact thoughts here when he says just as much to the other investigators. So we know right off the bat who's going to be killed, even if we remain skeptical of the killer's identity. And this clever tactic then enables Christie to spend quite a bit of time developing the characters before the murder actually takes place. And the novel is nearly half over by the time the body is found and Poirot begins his investigation. Some readers have criticized the novel on this basis for its slow beginning, but it didn't really bother me. The fact that I knew at least a little bit about the avowed murder allowed me to sort of begin forming my own suspicions before anything had officially happened, all while learning a bit more about the characters. And the characters, to me, are another standout in the novel, especially the Boynton family. The four Boynton siblings are tormented by their controlling mother, almost as if they're under some kind of hypnotic spell. We learn that each of the four, plus one Boynton by marriage, Nadine, has sufficient reason for wanting their mother dead, since she shows them absolutely no love, and her iron grip harms each of them in a different sort of way. Not only that, but through their resistance to their domineering mother, these siblings have grown closer to one another, and that makes us wonder to what lengths they would go to protect one another from harm. We learn all this about the Boyntons through the eyes of a pair of outsiders and fellow vacationers, the eminent psychologist Dr. Gerard and doctor-in-training Sarah King, who seem fascinated, albeit horrified, by the way Mrs. Boynton controls her prisoners/children. These observations, along with some offhand comments they make later, also eventually cast suspicion on both of them as part of a sort of second-degree ring of suspects, which includes a few other characters as well. And this aspect of the novel was interesting to me because in contrast with some of Christie's other novels, in which Poirot is present during this first round of sort of psychoanalysis and character observation, here we rely exclusively on the testimony of other characters, which may at least me question to what extent do we actually believe that they're correct in their assessments of the Boyntons. The way Mrs. Boynton is portrayed in such an unsympathetic light also forces several of the characters, along with the reader, to ponder whether they even care if her death was a murder. As one of the suspects remarks, is murder so bad if the result was to free a prisoner or even to save a life? Another tells Poirot that although she doesn't think it was a murder, she also doesn't think it's worth investigating whether it was, since basically good riddance, Mom. Now, these ethical dilemmas are never explored in detail, but they do force the reader to think, and they make the suspects here more sympathetic than in many of Christie's other novels. As for the mystery itself, there's a lot for me to unpack in the spoiler-filled section, but for now I'll just say there are a few elements of it that really stood out to me as super interesting and well done, but there were also some other aspects that I found very frustrating and somewhat diminished my appreciation of the novel. So I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. Definitely worth reading, but not one of Christie's best. However, unlike some Poirot novels where I'd give a similar rating due to the novel just being okay, with nothing that really stood out, in this case I felt the novel really did have some outstanding positive elements, but these were just balanced out by a few aspects that just really didn't work out for me. I'll give you a few seconds to make your escape if you're not interested in knowing what happens yet. Okay, spoilers beginning. There were several aspects of the murder presentation and the investigation that I found interesting here. One of these was the unverifiable testimonies from 5 different characters that Mrs. Boynton was alive when they individually interacted with her. I'm including 4 of the Boyntons, plus Lady Westholme and Mrs. Pierce here as a single testimony, and I'll say more about that last one in a minute. Poirot draws a lot of attention at this point as he jots down Mrs. Boynton's times of interaction with each character in his notes. The first thing, though, that got me thinking along these lines was when Lady Westholme, the first of the 5 to interact with Mrs. Boynton in her afternoon relaxing chair on the day of the murder, said the only reply she received was a grunt. Now, although I didn't consider the actual explanation that she was flat out lying, I suspected she may have actually heard someone else, maybe even the murderer, grunting to pretend that the actually dead Mrs. Boynton was still alive. Now, in hindsight, I think everyone else may have actually been out sightseeing, so this wasn't really a serious possibility, but at the time I didn't make this connection. Now, likewise, I was skeptical of other characters' claims that they had subsequently interacted with a living Mrs. Boynton, since Mrs. Boynton was never verifiably alive for those watching from afar, and since all we had to go off in each circumstance was the character's own testimony that Mrs. Boynton had been alive and had responded. You may have eventually realized, like me, though, that there's another implication of this. If we rejected the testimony of... likewise, I was skeptical of other characters' claims that they had subsequently interacted with a living Mrs. Boynton, since Mrs. Boynton was never verifiably alive for those watching from afar, and since all we had to go off in each circumstance was the character's own testimony that Mrs. Boynton had been alive and had responded. You may have eventually realized, like me, though, that there's another implication of this. If we rejected the testimony of any given character, then we also had to reject all later characters' testimonies. So at least one of the Boyntons had to be lying, and I assumed at first, mostly just a hunch, that it was Raymond that was the one lying here, and that he was the only one lying. Maybe he was indeed the murderer. Sarah King's testimony, of course, was that the body had certainly been dead for over an hour, which meant that at least one of the 2 had to be lying. However, I believe they were both lying. Since Sarah seemed to have a soft spot for Raymond and may have even been sympathetic to his motives for murder after talking with him for a while, I thought she actually may have lied about the amount of time since death to protect Raymond, who was with her before he returned to camp, so she knew that he would have been free of guilt. And as I might have expected, this was, of course, all wrong. All the characters were lying, every single one of the 5. Although this seems like a crazy coincidence at first, it's actually a pretty clever trick by Agatha Christie. So she established that the siblings were very close to one another and that they were also very suspicious of one another. So it seemed totally natural that they would all lie to protect another sibling who would have otherwise appeared guilty. This naturally also makes us question any other statements by the Boyntons. Although they don't say so to Poirot and the police, we can see from the start of the investigation that they all believe one of them killed their mother. It's just not obvious whether they all know which of them it was or whether their suspicions agree with one another. And in explicitly drawing our attention to the times that each character claims to have interacted with Mrs. Boynton, Christie hints to us while also potentially leading us astray at the same time. Many readers like me realize that some characters' sightseeing alibis meant that they couldn't have returned early enough to commit the murder at specific times, but we should really be placing equal attention on who left late enough to have been suspicious. And this was one of the biggest pieces of evidence working against the true murderer. There are a few other breadcrumbs that Christie lays out for us readers along the way, and although we can't always tell from Poirot's cryptic musings whether these clues are absolutely critical, we can at least take Poirot's word for it when he says something is important or unimportant. In an especially interesting scene late in the investigation, Poirot writes down 10 important aspects of the case. Some of these aspects are quite obvious and some of them not so much, but equally important are some of the seemingly critical clues that he omits, forcing us readers to question why certain clues aren't as significant to Poirot as they seem to us. We also get a hint at the psychology of two seemingly more peripheral characters, Mrs. Pierce and Lady Westholme, in an early conversation where Poirot ascertains that Lady Westholme is extremely attentive to detail, while Mrs. Pierce is not, and will simply corroborate whatever someone else says. Here, I admit I didn't quite connect the dots to see that this cast further doubt on Lady Westholme's claim of hearing a grunt from Mrs. Boynton, when in fact the old woman was already actually dead. And this was, of course, a key piece of incriminating evidence. And for me, this is what really stands out in Christie's best Poirot mysteries. Although I can be sure that Poirot will tie the clues together in a manner far more neatly than I also never feel totally lost. I feel clever the whole way through the book for having picked up some key clues and for having other hunches, yet I can look forward to an ending with a satisfying surprise that proves many of my suspicions wrong. Unfortunately, while I enjoyed the setup, the characters, and the investigation, I found the solution less satisfying. First of all, although I love a good reveal scene, this one just dragged on too long. It was awesome seeing Poirot work backwards in chronological order until finally arriving at the true murderer, and that aspect of it really made me feel smart for having worked backwards and figured out which characters had to be lying. But by the time Lennox confessed to the murder, only to recant just a few pages later, I was getting a bit frustrated. This confession felt unbelievable if true, since aside from motive, we had little evidence actually pointing to Lennox. And during Poirot's early interrogation, Lennox seemed to me so preoccupied about his rift with Nadine that he hardly could even focus on the questions about the murder at all. But if, as I suspected, his confession was not true, then it felt to me more like annoying stalling than actual suspense. And the final solution involved a whole lot of coincidence. I realize, of course, that any decent detective story will naturally involve some amount of coincidence, but there's a proper balance to strike because too many coincidences can often be a clue in itself. For example, one thing that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me was the reason for the murder by digitoxin poisoning. We learned early that Mrs. Boynton already takes digitoxin as a daily medicine, but was poisoned by an unusually large quantity. To me, this heavily implied a few things. The murderer probably knew that Mrs. Boynton was taking this medicine, so maybe it was one of her family members, or maybe it was a doctor who, for some reason, observed this more easily than your average person. And the murderer knew enough medicine to know that the substance was poisonous and that a doctor would probably have some of it with him. Most characters pass some or all of these criteria. Lady Westholme seemingly fits neither of them. Apparently, it was just a fortunate coincidence that she rummaged through the doctor's medicine and found this poison that the victim was conveniently already taking in smaller doses. It's possible that I missed something here, though, or maybe it's just common knowledge in 20th century England that digitoxin is the way to go if you want to poison someone. Let me know in the comments if you had a different take on this, but I didn't quite get it. For me, though, a much bigger coincidence was that this near stranger, Lady Westholme, happened to come along and decide to murder Mrs. Boynton at precisely the time when her family members wanted to do the same thing and were discussing plans among themselves. From the Boyntons' perspective, this is incredibly convenient, aside from, of course, that they would then be suspected of murder and all that. Although we, the readers, know that the blame would inevitably fall on the Boyntons themselves, it's unlikely that Lady Westholme understood quite how suspicious this would look. It seems as if the most she really knew was that Mrs. Boynton wouldn't be missed by any of her family members. So either Lady Westholme completely independently hatched a nearly identical murder plot at the exact same time as Raymond Boynton, or she was yet another person who overheard this apparently loud conversation between Raymond and his sister Carol on the first night at the hotel discussing how to kill their mother. Side note, what kind of a person stands in a hotel and loudly proclaims that someone needs to be killed loud enough so that not one but two or more people overhear this? And partially for this reason, I was disappointed when Lady Westholme ended up being the murderer, because she just didn't have any apparent motive until the very end, and it seemed like it would have been an amazing coincidence for her to have independently been hiding such a motive. Thus, she wasn't really even in my circle of suspects. I mean, I thought she might be hiding something, because everyone always is in these books, but having her be an escaped criminal came out of left field. Really, the only evidence I understood as supporting this was Mrs. Boynton's cryptic comments at the beginning that were seemingly addressed to Sarah King. Comments that seemed minor at the time, but admittedly must have been important because Poirot keeps coming back to them. And sure, it's also true that in some of the best mysteries I've read, I've erroneously ruled out one of the prime suspects and only realized at the end that I made a big mistake. The difference for me here, though, is that in Christie's best mysteries, when I look back at the evidence, I think to myself, why did I rule that person out? That was silly of me. At the ending of this book, I instead thought that was silly of Agatha Christie, the author. I felt I had good reasons for not suspecting Lady Westholme very seriously. My suspicions were mainly centered around an inner circle, comprising the family themselves, who all disliked their controlling mother, and clearly had strong motives for wanting to be rid of her. Financial considerations aside. Then I also had a second ring of suspects, people who seemed to have become emotionally invested in members of the family, and that included Sarah King, Dr. Gerard, and Jefferson Cope. And to be fair, they were emotionally invested in the family. All three of them would later marry into the family, as we learn in the epilogue. As an aside, I think that epilogue was pretty silly and forced, but I don't read Poirot novels for realistic romance, so I'll try to let this one slide. Mrs. Pierce and Lady Westholme were, for me, on the third and lowest tier of suspects, barely even on the radar. We couldn't rule them out, but they also weren't central enough characters for me to consider them seriously, especially in a novel like this one where the primary characters have been developed more thoroughly than usual and have obvious motives. And it would have been more okay with me for one of these peripheral characters to be the murderer if there were really, really strong evidence exonerating the Boyntons, since Raymond in particular just seemed so incredibly suspicious. And I guess there was evidence, but I'm not sure most people would have been able to put that evidence together until the very ending. I think I would have found it more interesting if maybe 3/4 of the way into the book it was becoming very clear to the reader that none of the likely suspects could possibly be guilty. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and I'd rank it just somewhere around the middle of the Poirot novels I've read so far. Alright, so I wasn't too thrilled about the reveal of Lady Westholme as the murderer despite her unlikable personality. I'm curious what other readers thought, though. Am I being too hard on the Queen of Mystery? Did I miss key evidence that incriminated Lady Westholme or exonerated the Boyntons? Let me know in the comments who you suspected or what you thought of the reveal at the end. Bye, and happy reading.